Hi, I'm Martha from Learn How to Make Quilts. Let's make this cute purple pinwheel mug mat or tea time mat. I began with a bunch of rough triangle pieces that were about 2.5 inches on the long side and about 2 inches on the shorter sides. I pair them up with some green and some purple triangles. If you don't have small triangle scraps, then cut 2-inch squares. Cut 12 floral 2-inch squares, 6 purple 2-inch squares, and 6 green 2-inch squares. Use whatever color combinations you like. Then pair up 6 of the floral with the 6 purple and the other 6 floral with the 6 green. Pick up one set of 1 floral and 1 green, having right sides facing each other. Draw a line diagonally across the top block. Then sew a 1/4 inch from the line on one side and a 1/4 inch on the other side of the line. You will then have sewn the 2 squares together, and you will see 2 seams diagonally parallel to each other with a drawn line in the middle. Cut on the drawn line and open your pieces, and you should now have 2 squares that have 2 triangles. Sew all your squares together like this, and you should have 12 of the floral purple sets and 12 of the floral green sets. Each square should be 1.5 inches. Let me show you with some diagrams. Here's your square with the white line drawn diagonally in the middle. Then sew on the purple lines on either side of the white line. Then cut in half on the white line. Then open, and you should have 2 squares with each having 2 triangles, one of floral and one of the purple or the green, whichever you paired it up with. If you begin with scraps, then start by sewing the 2 triangles together, right sides facing each other, and sew on the long side. Sew one set, then sew a little past the first set and start the next without cutting the thread. This is called chain piecing. Here you can see my chain. I opened my squares and iron seam to the darker fabric. Since I began with scraps, I need to cut my pieces to size, so take to mat and line up the center diagonal seam with the 45-degree line on your mat, as you see the white line that I drew on there. Then line up the 2 sides where my fingers are and the arrows with the lines on the mat. Then trim those 2 sides even with those lines. Measure 1.5 inches from the bottom of the square and trim off the top where you see my white line, 1.5 inches. Now measure 1.5 inches from the left side of the square. See my white line, which you trimmed off already. Then trim off the balance on the right side. You should now have a 1.5 inch square trimmed off on all 4 sides. Once you have all your squares ready, lay them out the way you want them and begin piecing them together in whatever order you like. As you see from my 2 arrows above, iron seams opposite from each other. This is my pinwheel, and I have made 2 sets from the 4 squares, and now I just need to sew these 2 sets together to make one complete pinwheel block. My first pinwheel is complete and ironed. Sew all your pinwheels together. Here my 6 pinwheels are all sewn together. Now to add some borders around them. Cut 2 strips that are 2.25 inches wide by about 7 inches long or longer. Sew the 2 strips on the long sides of your pinwheel piece set. Trim off the extra lengths. Next, cut the 2 side strips 2.5 inches wide by about 9 inches in length. Sew on the 2 side strips and iron with seams pressed out in the directions the arrows are pointing. Then trim all sides evenly. Your mat top or mini quilt top is all done. Lay your top on your backing fabric, for which I use unbleached muslin. The backing fabric should be roughly a 1/2 inch bigger than the top all the way around. Now do the same for the batting as you did for the backing, making it a 1/2 inch bigger than the top all the way around. Now layer your 3 layers in order. On the bottom, put the muslin with the right side, if there's one, facing the bottom, then batting, and then center the top on top of the batting. Press and smooth all 3 layers. Now here you can use quilter's basting spray if you like to hold your 3 layers together, but I just used a bunch of pins. I'm just going to machine quilt these layers together by stitching in the ditch. Since I am going to sew on top, I choose a purple thread for the top, but since the backing of my mat is muslin, I'm keeping a beige thread in my bobbin. Then I sew in the ditch slowly and gently, sewing right over my pins to keep the layers from shifting as little as possible. Here you see the mat from the back, and you can see where I sewed in the ditch, around each complete pinwheel and the length of the side border. I drew some rough purple lines for you to show you better where I did the sewing. Now that my mat is quilted, I trim off all the edges, lining the mat up with my green cutting mat, and then using a ruler and rotary cutter. Now we need our binding, and unless you've already done this, we need to cut the strips for our binding. Cut 2-inch wide strips sewn together to make one long strip, or if you have enough fabric, just cut one piece. Piece your strips together like this. One side, the 45-degree angle is one way, and then the other side at the same angle, and they will match up like this. Then fold over and sew from corner to corner about a 1/4 inch seam, as you see in my white line above. Sew all your pieces together until you have one long piece at least 35 to 40 inches in length, long enough to go all the way around the mat. Iron seams and fold binding in half with wrong sides facing each other, right sides on the outside. Roughly lay your binding around the back of the mat, starting in the middle of one of the long sides. Make sure none of the piece binding seams come at the corners, which makes it difficult to lie nice and flat. Adjust accordingly. Put pins all the way around to prevent layers from shifting as you're attaching the binding. Pin the binding, leaving a 4-inch beginning piece, and then start sewing to the corner. Stop a 1/4 inch from the corner and sew off the mat. Here you see my 4-inch beginning piece loose, which will help me in piecing the ends together once I've sewn the binding on all the way around. At the corner, turn the mat to start sewing on the other side, and then flip the binding back. Then fold it over towards you. On top should be a fold even with that outer edge of the mat. Fold is by the arrow. After you've sewn all the way around, leaving about 4-inch ends on both sides, lay an open binding on top of each other. Overlap about 2 1/4-inch seam widths and pin in at that same angle as the beginning diagonal cut piece. See pin by white arrow. See 2 seam width overlapping by white line. Sorry, this is a little difficult to show in just photos, but maybe this picture is a little clearer. You see the pin, and the piece I'm lifting up is the piece that was overlapping the pin by 2 seams width. Now take that to your mat, and where your pin is, at that angle, line up the side of the binding with a straight line on the mat, and then line up the pin with a 45-degree angle line on the mat and cut off the excess. See my 2 white lines, one that is straight, horizontal, and the other one is the diagonal line. Put ruler on the diagonal line and cut with rotary cutter. Match up both ends, right sides facing each other, and sew together. After sewing together, if the binding does not lie flat on the mat, meaning it is too big or too small, adjust your seam accordingly. Little deeper seam to make it shorter, and narrower seam if you want to make it longer. Here I need to make my seam deeper since it is too long, doesn't lie flat. Once you've adjusted the seam accordingly, finish sewing on and then iron the binding out. Turn the mat over so you see the top of your mat. Turn the binding over past the seam that you see, and you're ready to stitch it on. This one is difficult to see, but bring the binding just barely past the white stitches, the seam, and stitch on the binding on the very edge. Put a pin in just before the corner to secure the binding. Then take another pin, hold it down on the binding, down the edge of the mat. While holding the second pin down the edge of the mat, turn that part of the binding over past the seam that seam that is going horizontally on the mat so that you have an even mitered corner, a corner at a 45-degree angle, and then pin it in place. And then you sew over that corner, and just as I showed you that corner, so now you can finish all the way around the mat, and it is now all done. I've just shown you how to make a mini quilt, and a bigger quilt should now not be that hard at all. As a little bonus, I will show you another mat, since I have these scraps lying around. I cut myself 12 pieces, 2.5 by 1 5/8 inches. Then I pieced them together like this. I have 3 different prints and I just rotated them. Lay in whatever design you like. Here are my pieces cut out and arranged in the design I chose, and I'm ready to sew them together. I sew them together in strips like this. My 2 sets of strips are sewn together. Now I just need to iron them and then sew these 2 together. My center is done, and I've sewn 2 border strips onto either side of the longer side of the mat, top and bottom. My strips are 2¼ inches wide by 7½ inches long. Sew on and trim edges. Attach another 2 strips to the sides of about 3 inches wide by 10 inches long. Then trim the edges and the top of your mat is done. Follow my previous instructions for quilting and binding and your mat is all done. Enjoy your lovely mug mats or tea time mats. Until next time, happy quilting!